Hello and welcome to a special video from the Linus Pauling Institute. My name is Dr. Alexander Michels and I am the Communications Officer for the Institute. I am making this video today in honor of Linus Pauling Day, which is coming up on February 28th, the anniversary of Dr. Linus Pauling's birthday. As we have in years past, this year we are holding a special webinar on vitamin C in honor of the day, but in addition, we're going to have an open house at the Linus Pauling Science Center where you can learn about and connect with the Institute's research and outreach programs. But one thing that I wanted to have included in the day was a connection to Linus Pauling's life and the legacy of the Institute. And for that, I turned to my guest today, Chris Petersen, who is an archivist for oral history and digital projects at the Special Collections and Archives Research Center, also known as SCARC, at the Oregon State University Libraries. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Alex. Very happy and excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And originally, I wanted to bring you out to our Linus Pauling Day event because I wanted to have you give a specific talk about your book, Visions of Pauling. And I thought that people coming to the event would really appreciate hearing about the genesis of the book. But as we talked about it and got into the details of the book, I realized that this was much of a bigger story than we could just fit into a little talk up in one of our lecture rooms. So I thought instead we'd bring you back for a webinar this spring. And so Chris has agreed to give us a webinar focused on Visions of Pauling. And we'll be bringing that out to you in April. But I thought that we would give a little intro or teaser for people. If nothing else, this will help bring people to your webinar to hear more. I wanted to start talking today about the Linus Pauling blog, because that's where the project began. But before I do that, maybe we should talk a little bit about Special Collections. To me, Special Collections was always a place that I could go to learn more about Linus Pauling. Can you give a quick overview of what Special Collections is, how it got started, and the merger to SCARC, and what your role has been?
Yeah, happy to. So I'll try to make this quick. The history of archives at OSU dates back to the 1920s with a rare book room that was donated to Oregon State, or Oregon Agricultural College as it was known at the time, by a woman in California who actually never came to Corvallis and had an interest in rare books and had a connection to OAC through a story that probably doesn't need to be told here necessarily. But in any event, she gave a bunch of rare books to the college library, and that was the beginning of collecting what would eventually become a Special Collections. That was a start. In 1961, the University Archives was established, and it was established in anticipation of the school's 100th anniversary, which was celebrated in 1968. So 7 years before then, they decided we need to get serious about collecting our history. And so they created a University Archives. So that came about in 1961. And the University Archives sort of went through a few different phases for a few decades, but they wound up being mostly a service organization for university administration. And that remained the case until the late 90s, early 2000s. Well, in the middle of that, Linus Pauling decided he wanted to donate his papers to OSU, and he made this announcement in 1986. And the university recognized that this was going to be a very large undertaking, and the University Archives was not staffed or equipped nor did it have the mission to accommodate this very large gift and very important gift of archival materials to the university. So they decided to create a separate unit called Special Collections. And so Pauling makes the announcement of his donation in 1986. 1 year later, the university hired the first Special Collections librarian, whose name is Clifford Mead. Mm-hmm. And that was the beginnings of a Special Collections department. And so from 87 until 2011, Special Collections existed as its own discrete unit and was staffed usually by 3 full-time employees, and then lots of student employees as well. That was kind of the staffing model for Special Collections. And so Pauling, as I say, made the donation in 86. In 87, the university hired staff and started to build out an actual facility and a unit. And then over the course of the next 7 years, the last 7 years of Pauling's life, he would send things to Corvallis from time to time, things that he no longer needed for his research. And there was a couple trips down to his house in Big Sur also that were made to load up a moving van and bring things up. So for those 7 years or so, by the end of Pauling's life in 1994, we had maybe 100,000 items from his collection, which is a lot. But that was actually only about 20% of the actual full collection. So after he died, there was a period of time that his estate needed to be resolved, and the rest of the collection arrived in Corvallis in 1996, roughly. That's about the time that the stuff was all here. And so I started working as a student worker in 1996, and was part of the early processing effort. And then 99, again, that was a milestone year where we had a space finally. Materials were all there. I graduated from college and was asked to stick around if I wanted to, and I did. And I had never left, so I'm still there. But from 99 until 2006, that was a really big focus of that unit's efforts, was to process the Pauling papers. And in 2006, the final Pauling catalog, as it's what it's called, which is 6 volumes long, was finished and released, published, made available to researchers, and the collection is still very heavily used. So that was kind of the early phase of special collections and that work. So yeah, 2006, the papers are finally processed. In 2010, Cliff retired, and at that point, the decision was made to merge University Archives, which had moved from the basement of Kerr admin building to the library in those intervening years, to merge the special collections and the University Archives together. So it becomes a much bigger unit at that point, going from 3 full-time employees to, I think we're at 13 now, and still a large student staff. And then leveraging these archival skill sets across a much bigger set of collections. I mean, the Pauling papers are by far the biggest single collection that we have. But when University Archives was added to the mix, then we all of a sudden had more than 1,000 collections that needed to have some attention paid to them. Well, in terms of scale, the thing that I find most compelling is that, so we have all the archival materials of Linus Pauling, of Eva Helen Pauling, and that includes their libraries as well. And so if you were to take all these materials in their boxes and set them down on the ground, line them up, and include all the books as well, it would stretch for 0.8 of a mile. It's 4,400 linear feet. That's how big the collection is. It's enormous. That it snakes up and down several ranges of shelving and going up and down and up and down and up and down. So it's a gigantic collection. In terms of what's in it, I mean, we have all of his manuscript material, all of his correspondence. There's almost 500 boxes of letters, research notebooks. Again, the libraries. We have his personal safe, the contents of his personal safe, which has a whole bunch of stuff related to scientific war work, which has over 1,000 love letters between he and Eva Helen that were shared. They were apart for 1 year. He graduated from school here and went to Pasadena, and she stayed in Corvallis for a year, and they wrote to each other every single day. So that voluminous correspondence is all contained in this personal safe. And then, a lot of notes, a lot of stuff that you might expect to find in an archive, related to science, related to peace, biographical materials. I think there's 6,000 pages of scrapbook leaves that we have. We've got at least that many newspaper clippings. There's a large audiovisual section. There's just, it's an extremely detailed and rich collection that has benefited from being described on a very granular level. Those 10 years, if you want to call it that, from 96 to 2006, where we're really focused on the processing it. A lot of time, a lot of energy devoted to that. But the result is that it's a very large collection that's very well used. It's very well used and very usable because of that level of description we put into it. So it's still easily the most frequently accessed collection that we have. And it always is every year.
We should get to the Linus Pauling blog. And so for people who aren't familiar with the Linus Pauling blog, which is really the genesis of this book, can you go into it and what it is currently and where to find it?
Yes, it is at paulingblog.wordpress.com. That's the location. And what it is currently is it's a vast repository of stuff about Linus Pauling. I mean, everything we've published over 800 posts, and most of those posts are 1,000 words or more. So there's more than 800,000 words in the project. It's very detailed and rich, and it's really kind of all over the place. We didn't start at day one of his life and ended at the end of his life when he was 93. We wrote about things that struck our fancy or that were connected to particular anniversaries. That's the word I'm trying to think of. Particular anniversaries. But everything is tagged and categorized. So using those links for the categories of the tags, you can aggregate content in those ways. And of course, search is a great way to navigate it as well. But it's a huge project, and it started in 2008. It was very active until 2021. Slowed down lately, mostly because of this book project. I expect we'll pick it back up again pretty soon. There's still things to say about Linus Pauling, but it's a very rich repository of information.
So as you mentioned in the intro to the Linus Pauling blog was first created in response to the Linus Pauling postage stamp being released, and it was kind of a promotional activity for that release. And it sounds like it morphed quickly into something more. Can you talk about those first days of the blog and why it shifted?
In 2008, the Postage Service released a series of stamps honoring United States American scientists, and Pauling was one of them. And so we're like, this is a kind of a big deal. We want to try to do something to spread the word a little bit more. And I'd been thinking about a blog anyway for other purposes. And we thought, this might be a good reason to get this going. So we started to do a little bit of research and settled on WordPress. And we decided that the first set of posts would be about the event, letting people know about it, covering it. We took photographs. And interestingly, this was not the first or even second or third time that Pauling had a postage stamp made in his honor. So we actually did a little bit of historical mining and writing about the history of Pauling and postage stamps. And so that was the beginning of it. But after that, what do you do? And I always had in my mind that this was a nimble space. It wasn't these giant research-heavy websites that we were creating. This is a nimble space. And so it put us in a position where we could start thinking about things in a more nimble way. Mm-hmm. And so we begin with the postage stamp. The second kind of phase of work with the blog was taking those big websites that I mentioned and using those as kind of our source of content. So, for example, we have a website on the nature of the chemical bond, and there's a narrative that was written by Pauling's biographer, Thomas Hager, and lots of primary source materials on there to illustrate the narrative and provide extra insight into it. But the narrative only touches on certain of those primary sources. There's a lot more there than what he actually spoke to in his narrative. Mm-hmm. And so I thought this might be kind of interesting to dig into those particular documents and see if there's stories we can tell from that set of documents that are not part of his narrative. So that was the next phase, and that lasted for a little while. But then after that, we just decided, this is a space for us to do whatever we want. We can tell stories from anywhere in the collection. They don't have to be from these websites. This is our space to do anything we want. And that's when things really started to kick into gear. And at that point, it was mostly me using my imagination about, this is a topic that I'm interested in, and let's dig into it a little bit more. Or there was an anniversary coming up, Pauling did this particular thing 50 years ago. Let's take this moment in time to write it up. And that's how things really evolved from there. So I spent a lot of time looking at the biographies of Pauling and finding things that I thought were interesting that weren't covered in depth, and thinking about, okay, this is something we can do. And then, so there were certain other occasions where we had topics that we got into that basically haven't been covered by biographers at all. And I feel like that was really a big strength of the project, of the blog project. And that kind of connected with the selection process that I went through for the book as well.
Because of that wealth of information, I mean, I mentioned, or you mentioned, that the blog is now massive. How were you able to narrow this down into the chapters for the book? I mean, there's so many things that you could have, excerpts from the blog that you could have worked with. How did you get it down to, I think it was it 17 chapters?
It was 120,000 words was what I was given, which we exceeded. It wasn't easy. So the story there is that World Scientific reached out to me asking me if I was interested in doing a project related to the blog. And they didn't really place any constraints on what I might do. And some of those early conversations with the editor that I was working with, we emerged from that for some reason with a 3-book project. It was going to be 3 volumes. Sent that along, and it went to the publishing side, and they said, we're not entirely sure that everybody's going to buy a 3-volume set, so maybe we should just go with 1. And I was like, okay, that's fine too, because I was excited by the idea of doing a 3-volume project, but also understood pretty well what the amount of work it was going to be. So they said, okay, let's just do 1 instead, and so I said that's fine. So what happened after that was I took kind of that collection of possibilities I put together for the 3-volume project, and I thought, what is the most original and the most substantive contribution that we've made to the understanding of Pauling? And that was my principle of selection for what wound up in the book, for the most part. There are also some things in there that I put in there because they're fun and they're short, and they also are probably pretty unique and original, but a lot of the chapters are pretty long and sometimes fairly dense and heavy, and I wanted stuff that was going to provide a bit of a palate cleanser for the reader. So that's pretty much how it evolved, and it was hard to make those decisions. There are some things that I think are really that fit within that model of what I described that were too long, and I couldn't add them just because they would dominate the book and make it a little too homogeneous relative to that topic. But I feel pretty good about the balance of content that was selected, and it's presented in chronological order, so the reader is able to sort of make connections from one moment to the next. But as I say in the preface, it's not a biography. It starts when Paul is in his 30s and he's working on the nature of the chemical bond, and then it ends with his death when he's 93. But I wrote, in addition to the preface, I wrote a pretty lengthy biographical sketch of Pauling's life, specifically for the reader who wasn't as well versed in Pauling's background. Because if you don't know a whole lot about him, you're probably a little bit astray as you go from chapter to chapter.
Yeah.
So providing that grounding there, these are the basics of this person's life. And a lot of what is in the book connects back to that biographical sketch here and there. And hopefully it's made it a work that's a little bit more navigable for a lot of readers.
Actually, if you think about it, you even have content that went past his death because the Linus Pauling Institute chapter goes almost to the present day.
That's right.
So the book isn't really you writing every chapter. I mean, obviously you authored some of the chapters. Who were these other authors?
Yeah, they were mostly students. In fact, I think they were all students, graduate students and undergraduate students at OSU. So we have had a really strong relationship with the History of Science program at OSU for many, many years, and several of them certainly came through that. We've had a strong relationship with the University Honors College as well at OSU, and a lot of the students that worked on the project came to us from the Honors College. The project developed a profile, and I was able to show it to people and say, this is something that we're doing, and do you think you might be able to be up to the task? And they always were. It's not easy. I've been just overwhelmed by the level of talent that this university has generated over the time I've been affiliated with it, specifically for this project, and they connected with this in a real way. But yeah, it's been a really cool collaboration between me and I think over 40 people have written for it total.
You selected various chapters that hit on various themes. And again, I'm not getting very deep into any of those because I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's going to read the book. But it is like getting kind of a curated tour of Pauling's life, because some of the chapters that are in here I've read before on the blog, but others I had no idea existed. I mean, it's just such a massive resource that it's hard to get to all of it. And so just kind of like a, hey, did you know? Kind of chapter pops up, and I found that fascinating.
Yeah. So I mean, that was part of the thinking too. Again, the main principle of selection is this unique and interesting and a nice contribution, but I also tried to mix it up in terms of, you think about Pauling's life, and he's a scientist and he's a peace activist. So there's aspects of both of that in the book for sure. I wanted to make sure that was represented. He was also in the midst of controversies pretty much all the time, and so there's lots of that as well. And they come from different angles and unexpected angles. So I wanted to be able to touch on all that stuff, and I wanted to provide a more personal view of his life as well. And some of my favorite chapters are the ones that get at what his life was like as a person, because my training is in history. I'm not a trained scientist. So the pieces of him that I connect with most are as an individual, because I never knew him. I never met him. I started working in special collections 2 years after he died, so I never had a chance to meet him. But I got to know him very well through his papers, through his work. I spent a lot of time with those letters thinking about which box should this go into. And you get a sense of the individual and his personality through that. And so I've always gravitated more towards the stories that we could tell about him as a human being. And I think that that's one of the strengths of the book.